The seeker stands before an ancient threshold, confronted not by external mysteries, but by the most profound enigma of existence, the fractured nature of the self. The concept of Coniunctio, the sacred union, the alchemical marriage, the fusion of internal opposites, emerges not as mere medieval superstition, but as a fundamental psychological imperative that has haunted human consciousness across millennia. This is the central problem of individuation, the reconciliation of warring factions within the psyche, and it represents perhaps the most demanding philosophical challenge facing the modern practitioner of inner work. The historical lineage of this concept stretches backward through the annals of Western esotericism with remarkable consistency. In the Hermetic tradition, emerging from the syncretic crucible of Hellenistic Alexandria, the marriage of Sol and Luna, sun and moon, masculine and feminine, active and passive, was understood as the fundamental operation underlying all transformation. The Corpus Hermeticum speaks of the union of mind and nature, the descent of divine consciousness into matter and its subsequent ascent, bearing the fruits of material experience back to the realm of spirit. This was not poetry, but psychological cartography of the highest order. Paracelsus, that iconoclastic physician-philosopher of the 16th century, reformulated these ancient principles through the lens of medical and spiritual praxis. For him, the union of opposites was not abstract philosophy, but the very mechanism by which the human being achieves wholeness. His three philosophical principles, sulfur, mercury, and salt, represented not merely chemical substances, but fundamental qualities of consciousness that must be brought into harmonious relationship. The true physician, Paracelsus insisted, was one who understood that healing occurs through the reconciliation of these internal forces, not through external intervention alone. Carl Gustav Jung, standing at the threshold of the 20th century, recognized in these alchemical texts a sophisticated symbolic system describing the process of psychological integration. The Coniunctio became, in his analytical framework, the ultimate goal of individuation, the union of consciousness and unconsciousness, ego and self, masculine and feminine aspects of the psyche. Jung's genius lay in recognizing that the alchemists, despite their ostensible focus on metallurgical transformation, were in fact engaged in a profound inner work, projecting their own psychological processes onto the matter in their vessels. The premise established by the Hermetic school is unambiguous. The authentic secret is neither a chemical formula nor an external technique, but an internal, psychological, and spiritual undertaking. The gold sought by the alchemist is the integrated psyche. The stone that transforms base metal into gold is the achieved wholeness of the individual who has confronted and united the warring opposites within. This is not a path of comfort or easy revelation, but one demanding rigorous self-examination, philosophical discipline, and the courage to descend into the darkest recesses of one's own nature. The doctrine of Coniunctio cannot be understood in isolation, but must be situated within the broader architectural framework of alchemical and hermetic philosophy. The system operates on multiple registers simultaneously, material, psychological, and spiritual, with each level reflecting and interpenetrating the others in accordance with the Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, as within, so without. At the foundation of alchemical thought lie the three philosophical principles identified by Paracelsus and elaborated by his successors, sulfur, mercury, and salt. These are not the vulgar substances known by these names, but archetypal qualities that permeate all existence. Sulfur represents the active, fiery, masculine principle, the soul, the animating force, consciousness itself in its expanding, assertive mode. Mercury embodies the fluid, transformative, mediating principle, the spirit, the capacity for change, the bridge between opposites. Consciousness in its adaptive and receptive mode. Salt signifies the fixed, stable, material principle, the body, the container, the crystallized form that gives structure and endurance. The Coniunctio represents the achievement of perfect balance and interpenetration among these three principles. When sulfur and mercury unite in the presence of salt, the result is not mere mixture, but genuine synthesis, a new substance that transcends yet contains its constituents. Psychologically, this corresponds to the integration of the active will, the fluid psyche, and the stable ego into a unified center of consciousness that Jung termed the self. This triadic structure finds profound resonance in other esoteric traditions, revealing the universality of this psychological insight. In Kabbalistic philosophy, the three pillars of the tree of life, mercy, severity, and balance, represent a parallel formulation of the same principle. The left pillar, severity feminine receptive, and the right pillar, mercy masculine active, must be reconciled through the middle pillar, balance, the path of integration. The Kabbalist seeks to ascend this middle pillar, achieving equilibrium between opposing forces at each level of consciousness, ultimately reaching Kether, the crown, the unified source of being. Neoplatonic philosophy, particularly as articulated by Plotinus and developed by Renaissance magicians like Marsilio Ficino, understood reality as an emanation from the One, descending through levels of increasing multiplicity and materiality. The spiritual path consists of a return journey, gathering up the fragmented aspects of soul dispersed throughout the material realm and reuniting them with their divine source. This is precisely the operation of Coniunctio, the gathering and unification of scattered psychological contents into an integrated whole. The Rosicrucian tradition, emerging in the 17th century with its enigmatic manifestos, encoded these same principles in elaborate allegorical narratives. The chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz depicts a 7-day alchemical process culminating in a sacred marriage, the union of king and queen, the reconciliation of solar and lunar principles. This is not historical narrative, but initiatic instruction, a map of inner transformation disguised as romance. The mentality required of the true adept is far removed from the dilettantism that characterizes much modern engagement with esotericism. The authentic practitioner must cultivate what Aleister Crowley, despite his provocations, correctly identified as true will, not the capricious desires of the ego, but the fundamental direction of one's deepest nature aligned with the cosmic order. This requires brutal self-honesty, the capacity to distinguish between genuine inner calling and the self-deceptions of fantasy and ego inflation. Furthermore, the adept must maintain what might be termed an occultist ethics, a recognition that increased knowledge brings increased responsibility. The unification of opposites within the psyche generates tremendous psychological power, and this power can serve either integration or inflation, healing or destruction. The alchemist who achieves Coniunctio without the ethical foundation of self-discipline and service becomes not a sage, but a magician in the pejorative sense, one who manipulates forces without wisdom. Finally, the disposition toward doubt is essential. The path of inner alchemy is not one of blind faith, but of empirical investigation of inner states. The practitioner must approach their own experiences with the same rigor a scientist brings to laboratory work, observing, testing, refusing premature conclusions, willing to abandon hypotheses that do not withstand experiential verification. This skeptical mysticism, paradoxical though it may sound, represents the authentic Hermetic attitude. Trust the process but verify every insight against lived experience. The path to Coniunctio unfolds through a precisely articulated sequence of psychological and spiritual operations. These stages, codified in alchemical literature and decoded by Jung as phases of individuation, represent not arbitrary divisions, but organic moments in the unfolding of consciousness toward wholeness. Each phase builds upon the previous, and none can be bypassed without compromising the integrity of the entire work. The great work begins not with ascent, but with descent. Nigredo, the blackening, represents the necessary confrontation with the shadow, those aspects of the psyche that have been repressed, denied, or projected onto others. This is the mortificatio, the death that precedes rebirth, the dissolution of the false self, constructed through social conditioning and egoic defenses. Psychologically, Nigredo manifests as depression, disillusionment, the collapse of cherished beliefs and self-concepts. The individual enters what St. John of the Cross termed the dark night of the soul, a period of profound disorientation in which previous sources of meaning and identity no longer provide sustenance. This is not pathology but teleology. It is the psyche's deliberate dismantling of inadequate structures to make space for more authentic organization. Jung understood Nigredo as the initial encounter with the unconscious in its most threatening aspect. The shadow emerges not as enemy but as rejected brother, carrying all the energy and vitality that the conscious ego has deemed unacceptable. The alcoholic confronts the addiction. The pious person encounters their rage. The rational intellect faces the irrational depths of emotion and instinct. This confrontation cannot be avoided or mitigated. It must be endured fully, with consciousness maintained throughout the descent. The alchemical texts describe this phase through images of putrefaction, decay, and mortification, the prima materia reduced to black, formless chaos. The Rosarium Philosophorum depicts the king and queen entering a bath where they dissolve and die, their bodies corrupting in the waters. This is psychological death, the ego's experience of its own insufficiency and fragmentation. The practitioner learns that what they believed to be their self was merely a collection of defensive structures, survival strategies, and borrowed identities. The danger of Nigredo is twofold. First, the individual may become identified with the shadow material, sinking into genuine pathology, uncontrolled acting out of repressed impulses, psychotic breaks, or suicidal despair. This occurs when consciousness is extinguished, when the ego dissolves completely, rather than remaining as a witnessing presence through the darkness. Second, the individual may flee the process, retreating into spiritual bypassing, premature transcendence, or renewed egoic defenses. Both represent failure of the work. The successful navigation of Nigredo requires what the alchemists called the Hermetic seal, the ability to contain the psychological material without either identifying with it or repressing it once again. This is active imagination in Jung's sense, engaging with unconscious contents while maintaining ego integrity, allowing the shadow to speak without allowing it to possess. The practitioner sits with the blackness, neither resisting nor indulging, simply observing the disintegration of the false self with compassionate awareness. Following the dissolution of Nigredo, the work enters Albedo, the whitening, a phase of purification, separation, and clarification. If Nigredo represents undifferentiated chaos, Albedo represents the emergence of distinction, the separation of subtle from gross, the clarification of what is essential from what is superfluous. In alchemical imagery, albedo is the washing of the blackened matter, the separation of elements, the distillation that produces a pure white substance. The albedo, the white stone, the purified mercury, the king and queen, dissolved in the bath of Nigredo, now emerge as purified essences, ready for reunion on a higher level. The lunar quality of this phase is emphasized. This is the work of reflection, of inner illumination, of insight rather than action. Psychologically, albedo corresponds to the development of what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold opposites in consciousness simultaneously without collapsing into one pole or the other. The individual who has descended into shadow in Nigredo now gains perspective on those contents. The shadow is no longer overwhelming darkness, but a specific collection of qualities, energies, and potentials that can be observed, understood, and ultimately integrated. This is the phase of discrimination and analysis. The practitioner examines the material dredged up from the unconscious with philosophical rigor. Which impulses represent authentic instincts that have been wrongly repressed? Which are genuinely destructive patterns that must be transformed? Which qualities attributed to the shadow are actually projections of the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspects of the psyche? The work of albedo is this careful sorting, this differentiation of psychological contents. The anima for the male practitioner, or the animus for the female practitioner, emerges with particular clarity during albedo. These are the soul images, the personifications of the unconscious psyche in its relationship to consciousness. The anima appears as feminine figure, muse, seductress, guide or destroyer, carrying all those qualities the masculine ego has failed to integrate: emotion, intuition, receptivity, relatedness. The animus appears as masculine figure, judge, warrior, sage, or tyrant, carrying all those qualities the feminine ego has failed to integrate: assertion, logic, independence, authority. The integration of anima or animus represents a crucial operation within albedo. The individual must cease projecting these qualities onto external figures: the idealized romantic partner, the admired mentor, the hated authority, and recognize them as internal. The man discovers his own emotional depth, his own capacity for intuition and receptivity, his own inner feminine. The woman discovers her own intellectual power, her own capacity for assertion and independence, her own inner masculine. This is not the elimination of gender, but the achievement of psychological androgyny, the internal possession of the full spectrum of human capacities, regardless of biological sex or social gender role. The danger of albedo is premature satisfaction. The clarity and insight achieved in this phase can feel like completion. The individual has confronted the shadow, integrated the anima or animus, achieved a degree of self-understanding. Surely this is enlightenment. But albedo is only purification, not transformation. The elements have been separated and clarified, but not yet recombined in a new synthesis. To stop at albedo is to remain in a state of analytical understanding without embodied transformation, to possess psychological insight without actual change in being. Some alchemical texts insert a third phase between albedo and rubedo: Citrinitas, the yellowing. This represents the first stirrings of reunification, the dawn breaking after the dark night and the pale moonlight. It is the solar consciousness beginning to emerge, the first heat of transformation that will culminate in the red work. Psychologically, Citrinitas corresponds to the moment when the practitioner begins to embody their insights. The shadow, once confronted and understood, begins to be integrated, its energies channeled into creative expression, its wisdom incorporated into conscious life. The anima or animus, once recognized and differentiated, begins to function as inner guide rather than projected fantasy or feared enemy. This is the phase of tentative experimentation with the new self. The individual tests new behaviors, explores creative expressions, allows repressed energies to find constructive outlets. The man who has integrated his anima begins to trust his emotions and intuitions in decision-making. The woman who has integrated her animus begins to assert her intellectual authority and independence. These are first steps, awkward perhaps, but genuine movements toward wholeness. Citrinitas also marks the emergence of what Jung termed the self, not yet fully realized but glimpsed, sensed, intuited. The self appears in dreams and fantasies as mandalas, geometric patterns expressing wholeness and balance, as divine figures embodying totality, as quaternity symbols representing the union of opposites. These are not projections of the ego, but emanations from the self, calling the individual toward their own completeness. The work culminates in Rubedo, the reddening, the phase of final integration, the achievement of Coniunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites. This is represented in alchemical imagery by the production of the red stone, the philosopher's stone, the lapis philosophorum, the substance that transmutes base metals into gold and confers spiritual immortality. The rosarium philosophorum depicts this phase as the resurrection and reunion of the king and queen, now purified through death and separation, joining in sexual union to produce the hermaphroditic rebes, the two-in-one, the unified being, containing both masculine and feminine principles in perfect balance. This is not a return to the original state of undifferentiated unity, but a higher synthesis that preserves distinction while transcending separation. Psychologically, Rubedo represents the achievement of individuation in Jung's full sense. The ego, purified and strengthened through the ordeals of Nigredo and Albedo, now aligns itself consciously with the self. The self is understood not as ego inflation, the ego claiming divine status, but as the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, in which the ego plays its proper role as the center of consciousness, serving the greater wholeness. This is the union of opposites Jung described throughout his work: conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, personal and collective, light and shadow, spirit and matter. But this union is not the elimination of tension between opposites, but the development of the capacity to hold that tension creatively. The individuated person does not transcend duality, but learns to navigate it with awareness and grace. Rubedo manifests in lived experience as a fundamental shift in the quality of consciousness. The individual moves from identification with the ego complex to identification with the self as the organizing principle of the psyche. This produces what has been described across traditions as liberation, enlightenment, or gnosis, not as otherworldly transcendence, but as the full embodiment of one's complete nature in the world. The philosopher's stone, in psychological terms, is the achieved wholeness of the personality, stable yet flexible, strong yet permeable, individual yet connected to the collective. The person who has achieved Rubedo possesses what Jung called psychological gold. The fully developed personality that can withstand suffering without breaking, that can contain joy without inflating, that can serve others while maintaining integrity. The Coniunctio itself, the sacred marriage, occurs in Rubedo as the final reconciliation of all previous oppositions. The shadow, once enemy, is recognized as ally and teacher. The anima or animus, once projected, is integrated as inner guide. The conscious and unconscious psyche, once in conflict, enter into ongoing dialogue and cooperation. Most profoundly, the individual experiences the union of their personal nature with the transpersonal self, the sense of being oneself completely while simultaneously participating in something greater than oneself. The most demanding and dangerous phase of the alchemical work occurs at the nadir of Nigredo, when the practitioner confronts what must be termed existential despair. This is not the melancholic depression of ordinary life, nor the reactive sadness to external loss, but a fundamental crisis of meaning in which the very ground of identity collapses. The alchemical texts speak of this moment with brutal honesty: the complete putrefaction of the matter, the corruption of the king and queen in the bath, the blackness blacker than black. Psychologically, this crisis emerges when the ego structure, built painstakingly over a lifetime, reveals itself as fundamentally inadequate. The persona, the social mask one presents to the world, is recognized as hollow performance. The self-concept, the internal narrative of who one is exposed as fiction. The values and beliefs that provided moral orientation are undermined by the emergence of shadow material that contradicts them absolutely. The individual stands naked before the abyss of their own unconscious, stripped of all defenses, confronting the terrible question: if none of what I believed myself to be is true, then what am I? This is the dark night of the soul in its most profound sense, the experience described with remarkable consistency across mystical traditions. St. John of the Cross wrote of the soul suspended between the no longer of ordinary life and the not yet of divine union, experiencing itself as abandoned by God and yet unable to return to previous modes of existence. The Christian mystics, the Sufi poets, the Buddhist meditation masters, all describe this threshold moment when the old self dies, but the new self has not yet been born, leaving consciousness suspended in a void of unbearable intensity. Jung distinguished this alchemical crisis from modern psychological pathology through the concept of teleology, the idea that the psyche moves toward wholeness with purpose and intelligence. Ordinary depression may be reactive, biochemical, or the result of trauma, but the existential crisis of Nigredo is purposive. The psyche is deliberately dismantling inadequate structures to make space for more authentic organization. This is not breakdown but breakthrough, not disease but development. However, this distinction provides little comfort to the one experiencing the crisis. The phenomenology of existential despair is indistinguishable from pathological depression. Loss of interest in previously meaningful activities, inability to experience pleasure, pervasive sense of futility, intrusive thoughts of death or suicide, somatic symptoms of anxiety and exhaustion. The difference lies not in the experience, but in the response and the context. The alchemical practitioner maintains consciousness through the darkness, refusing both the escape into distraction and the collapse into identification with the despair. The philosophical problem at the heart of this crisis is the confrontation with what Heidegger termed das Nichts, the nothing, the void, the fundamental groundlessness of existence. When all constructed meanings dissolve, when all identifications crumble, what remains? The terrifying answer that emerges in Nigredo is nothing, or more precisely, no thing. Not an absence, but a presence that cannot be captured in concepts, an awareness prior to all content, a consciousness without object. This is the moment of maximum danger in the alchemical work. Without proper preparation and philosophical grounding, the practitioner may interpret this encounter with the void as nihilism, as the confirmation that life is meaningless, that all striving is futile, that consciousness itself is a cosmic accident signifying nothing. This interpretation leads to genuine pathology, chronic depression, nihilistic philosophy as defense mechanism, or suicide as the logical conclusion of meaninglessness. Alternatively, the practitioner may flee the void through what Jung called regressive restoration of the persona, a desperate reconstruction of previous identity structures, a retreat into fundamentalism or addiction or compulsive activity, anything to avoid the unbearable openness of confronting existence without the protection of ego defenses. This represents failure of the work, a return to the beginning without having passed through the transformation. The successful navigation of this crisis requires what might be termed philosophical courage, the willingness to remain conscious in the presence of the void without constructing premature meanings or retreating into previous certainties. This is the negative capability that Keats identified as essential to the poetic mind, the capacity to remain in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. The alchemical practitioner must sit with the not knowing, must endure the dissolution of all familiar landmarks, must allow the death of the ego while maintaining the witnessing presence of consciousness. The existential suffering of this phase is not pathological but necessary. The ego must experience its own insufficiency completely before it can surrender its claim to sovereignty and accept its proper role in service to the self. The pain of this recognition is the fire of alchemical transformation. It burns away the dross of false identity, purifies the practitioner of ego inflation, and prepares the ground for genuine rebirth. Paradoxically, it is precisely this encounter with existential despair that makes authentic transformation possible. The person who has never questioned the ground of their existence, who has never faced the void, who has never experienced the complete collapse of meaning, such a person may live a comfortable life, but remains fundamentally unconscious, operating on borrowed values and unexamined assumptions. Only through the crisis of meaning does one gain the possibility of authentic meaning, meaning chosen consciously, meaning created rather than inherited, meaning earned through the ordeal of confronting its absence. The alchemical texts encode this truth in the axiom, "The stone that the builders rejected becomes the cornerstone." What the ego experiences as most terrible, the shadow, the void, the death of identity, is precisely what the self requires for its manifestation. The gold is not found despite the blackness of Nigredo, but because of it, through it, as its transformation. The crisis is not an obstacle to overcome, but the very means of transformation itself. The achievement of Coniunctio, the completion of the great work, produces what the alchemical texts describe as the philosopher's stone, the lapis philosophorum, the substance that transmutes base metals into gold. Decoded psychologically, this represents the fully individuated self, the integration of all aspects of the psyche into a harmonious and stable whole that nevertheless retains flexibility, creativity, and openness to further development. This state is characterized by several distinctive qualities that differentiate it from both ordinary consciousness and pathological conditions that may superficially resemble it. First, the individuated person experiences a fundamental shift from egocentricity to self-centricity. The ego no longer experiences itself as the master of the psyche, but as a functional center of consciousness, serving the greater wholeness represented by the self. This is not ego death, in the sense of dissolution, but ego transparency. The ego becomes permeable to contents and energies from the unconscious, while maintaining its discriminating and organizing functions. Second, the integration of opposites within the psyche manifests as psychological flexibility and balance. The person who has achieved Coniunctio can move fluidly between modes of consciousness that would be mutually exclusive for the unintegrated personality. They can be both assertive and receptive, logical and intuitive, independent and relational, disciplined and spontaneous. These are not alternating states, but genuine simultaneity, the capacity to hold opposites in creative tension without collapsing into one pole or oscillating unconsciously between them. Third, the individuated person develops what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to generate new attitudes and perspectives by holding contradictions in consciousness long enough for a third possibility to emerge. This is not intellectual synthesis, but psychological creativity, the spontaneous production of symbols and insights that transcend and resolve apparent contradictions. The Philosopher's Stone is precisely this achieved capacity for internal transformation, the permanent establishment of the psychological mechanism that generates growth and integration. Fourth, and most significantly, the person who has completed the alchemical work experiences a fundamental shift in their relationship to suffering and meaning. Having passed through the existential crisis of Nigredo and emerged on the other side, they no longer require external sources to validate their existence or provide meaning. Meaning is understood as something generated from within, through the dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, through the creative engagement with the archetypal depths. This produces a quality of psychological stability that can withstand tremendous suffering without breaking, that can contain joy without inflating, that remains centered amid the vicissitudes of fortune. The ethical implications of individuation are profound and often misunderstood. The person who has achieved wholeness is not liberated from moral responsibility, but experiences a deepening of ethical obligation. Having integrated the shadow, they can no longer project their darkness onto others or avoid responsibility for their own destructive potentials. Having connected to the self, they experience the interconnection of all beings at the archetypal level, making genuine solipsism impossible. The individuated person necessarily becomes an ethical agent in the world, serving the process of individuation not only in themselves but in the collective. This manifests in what might be termed authentic service, action in the world that flows from wholeness rather than compensation for inadequacy. The unintegrated person serves from neurotic need, to be loved, to be seen, to fill an inner void, to prove their worth. The individuated person serves from overflow, from the natural expression of achieved wholeness, without attachment to results or need for validation. This is the ideal of the bodhisattva in Buddhism, the tzaddik in Judaism, the saint in Christianity, the person who has achieved liberation yet remains engaged with the world out of compassion and recognition of fundamental unity. For the modern practitioner, the completion of the alchemical work does not mean withdrawal from ordinary life into contemplative isolation, but rather fuller engagement with the world from a position of integration. The Philosopher's Stone does not extract one from the problems of existence, but provides the psychological stability and wisdom to address those problems effectively. The individuated person brings to their relationships, their work and their community, not the fragmentation and projection of the unconscious personality, but the clarity and presence of achieved wholeness. The integration achieved through Coniunctio must be understood not as a static state but as a dynamic equilibrium. The psyche does not achieve perfection in the sense of completion, but rather develops the capacity for ongoing self-regulation and transformation. New contents continue to emerge from the unconscious, new challenges arise in external life. The process of integration continues throughout the lifespan. What changes is not that transformation ceases, but that the individual has developed the psychological apparatus to engage transformation consciously and skillfully. This is why the rigorous discipline and philosophical grounding emphasized by the Hermetic school remain essential even after initial integration is achieved. The achievement of Coniunctio is not the end of the path but the true beginning. The moment when one becomes capable of genuine inner work, when the preliminary clearing and preparation are complete and the real exploration of consciousness can commence. The Philosopher's Stone is both the goal of the work and the tool for further work. The individuated self is both the achievement and the foundation for deeper exploration. The responsibility that accompanies this achievement cannot be overstated. The person who has integrated the opposites within their psyche has access to tremendous psychological power, the power to influence others through presence alone, to manifest creative visions with unusual effectiveness, to see through pretense and projection in oneself and others. This power can serve integration or inflation, healing or manipulation. The ethical foundation cultivated throughout the alchemical process, humility despite achievement, service despite power, skepticism despite gnosis, becomes absolutely essential at this stage. The path to Coniunctio is not a metaphor but a map, not poetry, but precise psychological cartography developed through centuries of inner exploration. The sacred marriage of opposites within the psyche represents the fundamental operation underlying human wholeness, the telos toward which consciousness moves when unimpeded by unconscious defenses and projections. This is the great work in its most profound sense, not the acquisition of external knowledge or power, but the achievement of internal integration, the wedding of all that one is into a harmonious and creative totality. The modern practitioner stands in an age of unprecedented external sophistication and internal fragmentation. The tools of psychological analysis, the insights of depth psychology, the accumulated wisdom of mystical traditions, all these resources are available as never before in human history. Yet the fundamental challenge remains unchanged: the willingness to descend into one's own depths, to confront what one has denied, to integrate what one has rejected, to unite what one has divided. The discipline required for this work cannot be obtained through casual engagement or dilettantish experimentation. The path of alchemy demands philosophical rigor, psychological courage, ethical integrity, and sustained commitment over years or decades. This is why the Hermetic school exists, to preserve and transmit the authentic tradition of inner work, to distinguish genuine transformation from spiritual fantasy, to provide the theoretical framework and practical guidance necessary for those who would undertake the great work in earnest. The union of opposites achieved through Coniunctio is not the elimination of tension, but the transformation of destructive conflict into creative dialogue. The individuated person does not transcend their humanity, but embodies it fully, containing within their integrated psyche the entire spectrum of human potential: light and shadow, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, personal and transpersonal. This is the Philosopher's Stone, not a substance but a state of being, not a possession but a realization, not an end point but a beginning. The gold you seek is not in the crucible, but in the will that kindles the fire, not in the stone but in the consciousness that transforms it, not in the achievement but in the one who has become capable of achieving.